Welcome to a very special collaboration. FactSet meets Risk Reversal Media, and today we're joined by Michele Lieber. She's a Senior Vice President, Global Head of Government Affairs for FactSet. Michele, welcome to this collaboration.
Thank you, guys. I'm a big fan, so it's really nice to have the opportunity to get to participate today.
I like what you did there. You started off with a compliment to sort of ingratiate yourself. I totally dig that. We obviously are huge John Butters fans, so you're coming in the wake of all the things that he does with us. But this is a bit of a cross section because your world is sort of colliding with our world. We thought it was a really good time. And there are a lot of things happening in Washington, D.C. that are basically affecting markets. And it really starts with crypto. It starts with cybersecurity and all things sort of in those worlds. So maybe let's start at 30,000 feet and talk about what you're seeing on your end.
Absolutely. For the first time in my career, we're at an inflection point where you have the House, Senate, and the administration all working together to try to create guardrails, but to also foster innovation in areas like AI, crypto, but making sure that we have some rules in place as we go forward to continue to be a leader in all of these areas, but also to make sure that we don't have significant crises in the cyber area as well.
Yeah, so cyber is interesting to us because we've seen some, really crazy moves in individual names, stocks, that is, like how they have kind of, dealt with some internal issues, but also from a customer standpoint, the one thing that comes to mind was the CrowdStrike last year, the stock, dropped 50% on a huge issue with some huge customers like Microsoft and the like. So I'm just curious, as you think about what the priorities are of the new administration, you're talking about, AI, you're talking about crypto, and you're talking about cybersecurity. Now, there's some crossover, but how would you categorize the, really the focus of the new administration and what the priorities are right now across those three really important technologies?
Absolutely. I think we're going to start to see a sea change, right? So all the regulatory agency heads have left. We're going to have hearings coming up this week on some new ones coming in. And that brings with it a lot of new staff who are thinking about things a little bit differently than the prior administration. It'll be interesting to see, with the first time ever having a White House czar focused on AI and crypto who comes from Silicon Valley. And, I think that there's a really big opportunity to make sure that as they start to put guardrails in place, they really do focus on preventing crises, but also fostering innovation here in the U.S.
It's interesting. Everything for me is sort of a sports analogy, so I'll sort of make an awkward one. A lot of times these different franchises have a continuity in terms of coaching, and programs tend to be very similar, and it's seamless in terms of the changeover. But my sense is, and this is not a political comment, but you've been down there for a long time. If I had to guess, the last 4, 5, 6 months, you've probably seen things that you haven't seen in your lifetime down there. So how has your day-to-day job changed sort of on the back of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's really a lack of continuity. And I think one of the differences between this administration and prior administrations is a lack of institutionalists surrounding the president. The president is, in your world, right, much more than DC focused, although he was president previously, and he did have institutionalists around him previously. I think in this particular administration, you have folks that are really focused on creating opportunities to build and grow from a financial perspective. That said, I have seen a lot of hesitation and concern from folks on Capitol Hill that are very leery of making sure that they have the right tools in place to do their jobs as well. And I think that we're starting to see a way for them to move forward to work together. But I do think that, the clock for Congress is very, very narrow. They don't have a lot of time to do a lot of things. And so once we get through nominations, do they have the opportunity to really create meaningful legislation? And that is going to be a question over the next 18 months.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So when you talk about, obviously, the legislature being leery of some of this policy, right, and the fact that it really does change every 2 years if you think about what the priorities are for, the House in particular with the midterms, are these things that their constituents care much about? Because you just made a really great point, is like, like when you see some of these new folks that have come into the administration, they're really thinking about it from, how do they profit from it? When you see like the new crypto czar and the AI czar and that sort of thing, and that's a very different stance, if you will. And so I'm curious, when you see a lot of these kind of House members go back into their districts, and are these things that constituents care about? Do they care about crypto policy? Do they even understand what's going on with AI, that sort of thing? And then obviously cybersecurity, we all get our emails leaked all the time. I think we're just used to it at this point. So I'm just curious how you think, again, going back to the priorities, these are kind of things that I'm not sure that everyday voters really have a lot of knowledge about or care about. And how does that actually dictate what their, representatives are kind of voting for in the legislature?
I think that's actually a great question, because members of Congress do devote a lot of time to constituent services, right? And who calls in, who weighs in, and it really is very important. And I do think that will continue to be a focus as they go to town halls and they find like the price of eggs has not gone down. And they need to make sure that those things are addressed as well. And so economic policy is going to be incredibly important. We're going to have, some tax provisions that expire. That's going to be really significant for folks on Capitol Hill. And is it going to be a priority for the administration? We're not really sure yet, because we haven't heard from the folks that are taking over the helm of some of these regulatory agencies. So there might be a bit of a disconnect. But I do think as people go to town halls and hear more about, the interest of their constituents, they're going to bring that back with them. And make decisions based on those comments and questions that they're receiving.
Yeah, so let's talk about going back to 2015, right? And you talk about fostering innovation. I mean, you think about, these massive companies in the U.S., which have actually, if you think about it for a whole host of reasons, they're probably, whether it be the Microsoft, the Google, the Amazon, Facebook, and, Apple, and there's probably a couple out, NVIDIA in particular. You think about technological innovation. I mean, it seems like the lion's share has come out of the U.S. And we go back to the 2016 election, the 2020 election, and there was a lot of kind of back and forth at who that was actually helping from a political standpoint. So I'm curious, how do you think it plays out? Some of the biggest suits that came against big tech started in Trump administration 1.0. They picked up a lot of steam as you got into the Biden administration. It was one of the probably the big reasons why you saw a swing by a lot of those big tech companies and political leanings and the like. And obviously Tesla is a huge part of that. So going forward, though, in this administration, do you expect too many changes despite, like the cozying up by a lot of these big tech CEOs? Like, is it going to stay the course, the focus on these big companies by the FTC from a competitive standpoint, but also the policy of their, the politics of these big companies?
I think, and I'm not on the inside with those CEOs, but I do think they feel more welcome just based on the optics, right? They feel more welcome in DC and to have a seat at the table for policymaking. And I think that will help to continue to foster new innovation. And I think having that opportunity, there's a lot of members of Congress that those folks were scared of in the past that I don't think that they're as afraid of right now. And as you all know, every member of Congress has the opportunity, particularly in the Senate, to put on hold on legislation, on any legislation other than nominations. And so I do think that as things start to move forward and they start to create these meaningful opportunities, I do think that legislatively there will also have to be engagement by these companies to work constructively with members of Congress and their staff as well.
I'm going to give you two names that are not household names, but I think over time they potentially could be. Alvaro Bedoya and Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, two FTC commissioners that were recently fired, and I think they're probably going to file suit for wrongful termination. And whether the merits of that case are heard or not heard, I don't necessarily know if it's the point, but it's a bigger thing. I mean, we haven't seen things like this. Typically, those folks can only be fired for cause. Now, seemingly something else is going on. My question is, could this potentially happen in terms of what we're seeing at the Federal Reserve? I guess, could this be sort of an opening salvo to try to get like a Jerome Powell out of the seat?
Well, one of the most interesting things in the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration was an executive order that President Trump issued that said that independent agencies do have some obligation to report into the White House. So I do think that some of those executive orders will play a role in all of this. We also, one of the things about both Bedoya and Slaughter is that they were the opposition on the FTC board. And so having that vacancy does kind of upset the normal power structure that the FTC has had over many years, where you have the minority representation from the other party on those boards. And the same thing has happened at some of the federal financial regulators, where a lot of folks are leaving, and I don't see them being replaced at the moment. So I do think that that will upset the normal structure that we've seen at these agencies. Will that encourage additional M&A? Will that encourage new people coming in? And, the recommendation by Democratic members of Congress to put other people forward, that's a big question that has not been answered yet.
It's interesting, Michele, Guy, and what he was getting at is the whole notion. And this was something that, over the last, call it 6 years. And since I guess really, Jerome Powell was nominated by, President Trump in the first administration, he's really kind of been all over him about rate policy and the like. And so, when you see what just happened to the FTC and kind of he's going to put loyalists in there, the question would be for the Federal Reserve. He's going to try to do the same thing, which you just kind of indicated. And, that's the sort of thing that could really cause, I think, CEOs here in the U.S., the way they deploy capital with CapEx and hiring and the like, and also foreign investment. If the idea that the executive branch has all of this power to kind of put loyalists in there and do what they want to do, is that something that you're hearing more and more about? Because the way I think about it, we've never seen the use of executive order in such a short period of time as many of them are. And also I have this idea of like a single point of failure. The whole idea that we have checks and balances, that we have apolitical people in a lot of these sorts of, really important financial sort of areas and the like here, whether they're meant to protect consumers, you know what I mean? Like the CFPB or stuff like that. I'm just curious how you think about that, because this administration looks very different than almost everyone that we have seen in the last 80 years. You have to go back to like a wartime president like FDR, where you've seen this sort of executive power.
Or Andrew Jackson. I will say that, I'm a recovering lawyer and a political junkie. And so I kind of view our system of checks and balances as the best in the world. And I think I believe in it. And I do believe that we will have the ability, as we kind of move forward, to see, our judiciary playing a role here. That said, I do think President Trump is different than other presidents we've seen, particularly those that have kind of grown up in the system. And I do think that President Trump has a view that those in the government should work constructively with him. So, for example, his view of how the attorney general works is very different than prior presidents. And I think, we've seen some changes in that regard. I think he has a different view about how the Federal Reserve should function, and has made some comments recently about interest rates. I do think, however, that he's been so far reluctant to change the structure of the Federal Reserve. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that he has worked within our financial system for a long time. And I do think that he does watch our financial system. So I think over time, we'll start to see how that plays out with the independent regulatory agencies and those that go into the helm of those agencies after they have been confirmed by the Senate.
Michele, the Biden administration, I would submit, was benign to maybe even slightly negative for the crypto landscape, and people can push back on that. But this clearly is an administration that's crypto friendly. So what are you hearing sort of and seeing on the crypto front in terms of policy, potential taxation, and those types of things?
Well, I actually remember there was a time when crypto CEOs were tweeting at the government and not actively participating. This last election showed us it's a very different landscape. They're very engaged. They're very part of everything that's happened. And they are spending a lot of time coming up with the approach that they want to take to help us kind of set forth on a new path in crypto. That said, I do think that stablecoin legislation will be the first, if any, to be approved by both the House and Senate. I think that will create a meaningful opportunity for other types of crypto discussions, but I don't necessarily think that we're going to see meaningful, broader crypto legislation this Congress. But I do think there will be a lot of discussion about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because that was something that really did sway a lot of voters, right? As you think about this past election. But I think more importantly, and I think that's kind of like the shiny object, which with crypto, those get a lot of big headlines. We're being inundated though right now with headlines about AI. And when you think of, let's say, most Americans right now, how are they interacting with this technology? Well, it's helping them write some emails and, do some other things, but it's not really part of the day-to-day life. And if you talk to legislative folks and they're starting to get their arms around this, it's like, this is a really serious technology. I think we can all agree with that. And it's very different than if you go back to the internet, which was really meant to be a consumer-oriented technology in the late 90s. And I think that's how a lot of folks interacted with it. But now if you think about like sovereign AI and you think of the importance of this technology, how it's going to be, integrated into defense system. I mean, the list goes on, right? There's some really important stuff. And it's never been, you have to go back to, I guess, the arms race with Russia, you know what I mean, to kind of like consider something that's that important. How do you think about this? Do you think there will be meaningful legislation, how this technology is used here in the U.S. and a focus on really how it is meant to combat that of, let's say, China and some other, really important adversaries?
I do think that AI is the shiny object right now, and I think everybody's talking about it. And I think the conversation has evolved because the technology has evolved. So at first we were talking in policy circles about Gen AI, and now we're talking about agentic AI, right? And so it'll be really interesting to see. I don't know that there will be meaningful legislation. I do think that there will be a lot of proposals out there. I don't know that anything comprehensive will be enacted, but I do think that we're going to start to see a focus at all the regulatory agencies on AI. And for example, the SEC later this week is having a roundtable discussion where they've invited some very influential folks in the industry to talk about AI. I think that for the first time, we're going to see a real interest both at the SEC, but at all of the federal regulatory agencies on what they can do from a regulatory proposal perspective on how they can start to put some guardrails in place on AI and how they can start to talk about, the importance of innovation. At the SEC right now, Hester Peirce is in charge of this task force on crypto, but she's also been talking about regulatory sandboxes for years. And so I do think that this is really the first time that the regulatory agencies can work closely with the White House and with the House and Senate to come up with some meaningful regulation.
Well, Michele, our worlds have clearly collided, and we're going to have you back because the first 100 days have been and will continue to be interesting, but then it's everything past that we should continue to talk about. So, Michele Lieber, Senior Vice President, Global Head of Government Affairs for FactSet, thank you for joining us. By the way, for you playing our home game, Judith Lieber bags are absolute works of art, but that's probably for another podcast. Thanks, Michele.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
Thanks, Michele.